Hello, and welcome to segment 4 of our course on DVD of Catholic Doctrine. Um, for this segment, I want to move into some of the um, actual doctrine that we talked about up till now, sort of uh, in advance. It's everything up till now has been a little bit of an introduction. Uh, in this segment, we're going to start talking about God. Um, and I want to start with a question that might hit you as funny as to why we'd be asking this question when we're beginning a discussion of God. But I'd like you to think about, what would you say if somebody asked you, "Who are you?" Um, I don't know about you, but that can be a little bit difficult question to answer. Um, I was asked that question one time in a very serious way and really had a problem coming up with an answer. I hemmed and hawed around and said some things that I did, or some roles that I have. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I work for the church. I thought, oh, I'm a child of God, I'm a Christian. All of those kind of were um, maybe circling around the reality of who I am. And I had to admit at a certain point, I can't express it. I think I have a sense, but I can't express it. I think we have to say that really, in many ways, we're mystery. And our whole life can be trying to discover what that mystery is. The answer to the question, who is God, I think we have to start with God is mystery. We can get almost too smart for ourselves sometimes, thinking, oh, we can describe God and we've got all these doctrines that say exactly who God is. And yet, I think we have to start with saying anything we say about God is probably not true, except maybe negative statements. We could say God is not human. Well, we have to go, well, yeah, that's true, although in Jesus Christ, God became human. We have to be very careful in using language about God. And so that's kind of the starting problem with everything we talk about in this class. It always has to be said with great humility. Now, we don't want to not say anything about God either, because God has communicated himself to us. We talked about Revelation. God has given us Jesus Christ as an indication of who he is. So, despite the mystery, we kind of walk out into this sort of, into the deep, I guess you could say, and hopefully we can tread water. So, you'll have to bear with me, and I think we'll all have to bear with one another, that a lot of the things that we have as doctrine, dogma about God, is always has to be tempered with that sense that God is mystery. A second little thing I'd like you to do, I'd like you to close your eyes wherever you are, and when I say the word God, what do you picture? What's that picture of God look like in your head? An old man sitting on a throne with a beard? A light? Jesus himself? It could be a variety of pictures that we might have. I think that one of the things that we do as human beings is we make the mistake, in a way, of creating God in our image. It is said that in creation, God created humans in His image, and we've returned the favor. We create God in our image. So one of the things that I think we have to be aware of is false images of God. I think there's a lot of atheists out there who don't believe in God, but I don't believe in the God that they don't believe in either. I know that there was a story of one of the early Russian cosmonauts blasting off into space, got up into space, floating around the Earth, looked around and reported for all the Earth to hear, God's not up here. Therefore, there is no God. I don't see God anywhere. Well, I don't believe in a God who sits on a cloud or sits above the cloud, behind the moon or wherever, either. God is very different from that. So I think one of the things that I want to do early on here in this segment is to maybe, because of what's in the Bible, if some of the things, if read too literally, would lead us to conclude that God is not who God really is, that there are false images of God that we could really derive from certain sections of the Bible. Like, for instance, God is an avenger, or God is just a watcher sitting above us, watching. God is a punisher, raining fire and brimstone down. God is kind of a puppeteer, controlling everything. Maybe God is a dictator, or God is just absent. And I know there may be times in our lives or things that happen to us in our lives that would lead us to make those conclusions, but I really believe we have to take the whole Bible, and particularly who Jesus is and what Jesus said and how the New Testament unfolds who Jesus is, as our really strongest indicator of who God is, and not to take an isolated story or example from the Old Testament maybe and say, this is the reality of who God is. I just think that's a mistake. Even in the Old Testament, God is trying to move the Hebrew people away from what I would call, I know this isn't a very good word to use for this, but from what I would call a sense of a primitive God, a sense of God that is not really as the God of Jesus Christ. The primitive God sits on high, very separated from us, and we are down below, in a sense, needing things. We need rain on our crops, or we need healthy children, or we need food to eat. So if we have a sense of God that is this primitive God, what we have to do is wake God up, reach out to God with rituals or sacrifices or whatever else, and please God with what we have to offer. If we do the right thing, say the right thing, have the right ritual, make the right offering, which in the Old Testament included killing animals and sometimes even sacrificing children, then God would return to us, be pleased with us, and give us what we need. So it was really this cycle of kind of we have to make the move. We have to get God to love us. We have to do all kinds of things to open God to meet our needs. And sadly, I see and hear talk today that seems to assume that that's our relationship with God. But really, in the Bible, I think what we see, the God of the covenant is not a God that's waiting for us to do the right thing. This God initiated with Abram, initiated with all of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, initiated with Moses, initiated with David, initiated with Mary. This God gives us what we need. This God is a giving God, a loving God who reaches out to us. In terms of the covenant, this God wants a relationship with us. So the covenant is a matter of us praising God, giving back to God, giving to our fellow human beings, obeying certain laws or commandments in response to God's love, not in order to acquire God's love. That's the covenant God that is prefigured in the Old Testament, in the covenants, but especially in the New Covenant brought to us in Jesus Christ. God really helps us see who He is by sending His Son. Now, why is it that so many people, and ourselves included, might have weak or false images of God? I think it has to do with faith maturity. And I'm going to, right now, move through a number of what I would call faith stages to kind of help us understand how we grow in our sense of who God is and deepen and mature in our faith. And that images we might have when we're less mature would be less adequate images. And I think we can see that in the Old Testament. This is my own opinion, but I really believe the early stories, books in the Old Testament are the beginnings of the discovery of who God is, the beginnings of maturing in their sense of, or realization of who God is, their deepening faith as the Old Testament moves along, especially as we arrive to Jesus Christ. So these faith stages are based somewhat on the work of James Fowler, who's developed a whole theory of faith growth and faith stages. I use different terminology because he has kind of scientific terminology that he uses. And I think what we will see as we move through these faith stages, that in our own lives we've grown and developed. And these stages are not meant to be a stairway to heaven, because every one of us grows in faith kind of like the development of a tree, so that the inner rings of a tree are the immature, you could say young sapling, but it's still a tree. And as the tree grows, it adds rings, or you could say stages of growth. And if you could picture it like that, one of the things that I think we could say is that that little sapling is a tree. But if we came back in 30 years and it was still a sapling, we'd have to say, hasn't matured, hasn't grown. And in a way, I think we could say the same thing about us. The Holy Spirit is inviting us year after year through various stages of faith to help us grow into more of a reality of who God is and who we are in relationship to God. So, the first stage of faith is what I call imaginative faith. It's the faith of little children. It has to do with emotion and mystery, not a lot of logic to it. Images would be very much like we mentioned a while ago. For a little child, God is this old man sitting on a throne up in heaven. God might be very scary. I know for me, when I was young, I remember being really afraid of God. And so little children, it's just openness and belief and trust, and yet not really very clearly I guess, described or delineated. It's kind of like a little child's relationship to their parents in a way. They think their parents are maybe giants who can do anything. And so the imaginative faith stage would be for young children. Now, one of the issues here is that if fear is implanted in the child and this becomes the core of their faith, I think that's a problem, because later on I think they're going to rebel against that. So fear is not a good core here, somehow to communicate to the child that this God out there that they might be afraid of somewhat really wants to hold the child in his arm, as Jesus does. The second stage is what I will call the literal faith stage. There comes a time when, in the growth of faith and the growth of every human being, when we realize that God is a lawgiver. There is a certain order to the universe. There is a certain order that God kind of calls his people to. And in the Old Testament, we can really see this. You don't go very far into the Old Testament before you come to the 10 Commandments. You come to all the Jewish laws of ritual purity and what they can eat, what they can't eat, and how they worship at the altar and sacrifice. And Christians as well, we have our laws, a very necessary thing that we have laws, because it gives us a boundary to work within as believers. It gives us clear expectations. But we don't want to go in the direction of being legalistic. I think someone who's really rooted in this sense of who God is believes that God is a rewarder and a punisher according to whether you obey the law or not. And it all has to be fair. Jesus kind of breaks this open a little bit when he tells the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Well, the people that come at the last hour of work receive the same wage as the people who came and worked all day. What sense does that make? To someone who is legalistic in this kind of literal faith stage, that's a real problematic parable. And yet I think Jesus is kind of trying to break that open a little bit, that the law is important, but there's more to God than reward and punishment. And there's more to living a life of faith than obeying laws. The next stage of faith is what I will call group faith. Group faith has to do with the community. We, as Catholics, as Christians, Jews, whatever faith, we tend to come together in community. And we receive our faith through the community. The stories passed on in the community. The customs and traditions of how we worship or how we identify ourselves all come to us through community. And it's a powerful way for us to be in faith, and a very essential aspect of our faith that we be rooted in community. The body of Christ is who we are as Christians. We are together as we kind of walk the road, the journey of faith. One of the problems with the group faith, even though it's really essential, we certainly wouldn't want to say we don't need community or we don't need the group. But one of the problems is we can get to the point where we feel like we're the chosen ones. It's kind of us versus them. The story of Jonah in the Old Testament is kind of a breaking apart that sense among the Israelites that they were the chosen race, they were the chosen people of God, and everybody else was outside of God's love. Well, Jonah gets called to go preach to the Ninevites, and he didn't want to do it. And God drew him there despite his attempts to run away. God loved the Ninevites as well. So this communal faith, powerful, essential but limited. The next stage of faith is personal faith. Now, there's a real dividing line here, because up to this point, sometimes we can just sort of be maybe along for the ride, you could say, where if we get to a point of personal faith, it becomes a confrontation between me and God, an encounter, I guess I should say, between me and God that calls me to a personal relationship with God. Sometimes the Protestants would call this being saved. It's a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It's a way of saying, yes, I own this faith. It changes who I am. It affects who I am as a person. It's me and Jesus, or me and God, and I have to kind of give myself over. It involves a change of values. It involves maybe a real radical life change. It's a conversion. Every one of these is a conversion in a way, but this is a real conversion. And I think we have to take it very seriously. Jesus says, "Come follow me," to the apostles. Peter and Andrew, they drop their nets, leave the fishing boat, and follow the Lord. So Jesus is calling us to this, all of us to this, a personal faith. The next stage of faith is what I will call mystical faith. And this is kind of, I guess you could say, there's a story of Thomas Merton in Louisville, Kentucky, who had this kind of faith experience that goes beyond kind of the normal. And in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, Thomas Merton is there, and he looks around, and everybody he sees somehow has the light of God shining out of them. He looks at everybody and sees the presence of God. And a mystical experience, maybe you've had a mystical experience, is something like this. It's a sense of God's presence in me and in all things and in all people. There have been some very famous mystics throughout the history of the church that, in St. Francis of Assisi was one of those who just really saw God's presence in all people and in all of creation. This kind of experience changes you. Now, I think some of us reach this mystical faith. Maybe we dabble in it a little bit and back off because it has a lot of implications. One of the implications is, as Jesus says, love your enemies. This doesn't make sense to love your enemies unless we somehow have a sense that God is in them too. So it's really important for us to kind of have a sense that we're being called into this kind of faith as well, into this mystical faith, this sense of God is everywhere and all present. So it's very much of a challenge. Last but not least, get to the bottom of the paper here, is sacrificial faith. Now, sacrificial faith is a total surrender to God. How many of us reach this? This was the faith of Jesus Christ. It's a point at which I don't have agenda anymore. God's agenda is my agenda. I sort of disappear into God. Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King. Sometimes these people end up getting killed because the world can't stand to kind of live with this kind of faith. But it's a very powerful kind of total surrender into God. Now, in a way, we could say that God, and in God's self, is sacrificial faith. God is a giver, a total giver that has given himself to us in a radical way that we really can't understand in a sense. It's for God to become human as Jesus Christ is for us a kind of sense of sacrificial faith. It's the grain of wheat that falls into the ground and dies in order to not remain just a grain, but in order to flower forth in an abundance of giving. This is the kind of giving that God does.